Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. The Odyssey and Odysseus is all the rage these days. Hard to get into the movie at the moment. Everyone's going to see it. Last week, we did a show with Joel Christensen, a professor of Homeric Studies at CUNY, distinguished professor, about the movie and Odysseus. His new book is called Why Odysseus? Survivor, Scoundrel, Anti-Hero. And when I saw the film, it seemed to me as if maybe Odysseus was, in some ways, at least in the Nolan version of the movie, a kind of statesman. And that subject of statesman and statesmanship is the subject of our conversation today with another very distinguished professor, this one of political science at Yale University, Stephen B. Smith. And he has a new book out, appropriately enough, called On Statesmanship. Stephen hasn't yet, we talked just before we went live, Stephen hasn't yet seen Nolan's Odysseus, the Odyssey. So, Stephen, before we begin talking about your book on statesmanship, you haven't seen the movie. Do you think that there's a case to be made that Odysseus should be viewed as a kind of statesman? Is that a legitimate argument?
It's a good question to start with, Andrew. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me on your show. Right, I have not seen the film. I'm in New York now, and it's impossible to get in, although I'm hoping to see it next week. I think there is a case for Odysseus. He's not a statesman in any technical sense of the term. He didn't found a state. We don't see him in any way as a head of state in any way. And yet Odysseus is known, famously known as a wily character. The famous word associated with him in the opening sentence of the book is he's polytropos, a word that has been, there's a lot of controversy about how that word should be translated. I believe one contemporary version of it is it's complex. He's a complex man, but the version I prefer, the translation I prefer of polytropic is many-sided. He's got different dimensions to him. And I think that is, as I talk about in my book in a different context, it is this quality of adaptability that is essential to statesmanship. Machiavelli is another one who certainly employs this notion of being able to adapt to circumstances, adapt to the times, as Machiavelli says. You cannot allow yourself to be locked into a frigid or a rigid framework, but you have to understand your situation and context. And in that way, I think Odysseus is in many ways a model, a certain kind of model for what statesmen need to do.
Yeah, you mentioned Machiavelli. Of course, Machiavelli famously wrote about fortune being a woman and needed to be ridden. I'm not quite sure what the Italian translation or the Latin translation is, firmly. And Odysseus, of course, is also a leader of men. And I know you haven't seen the movie yet, but it's in some ways, the movie is about Odysseus as a leader of men, although he's not always the ideal leader. Is that what statesmen are supposed to do, Stephen? Lead men? Is statesmanship all about leadership? Is that what you argue in your new book?
Of course, it's about leadership, centrally. And yet, I do want to make a distinction in the book, as I do, between statesmen and leaders. Every state has a leader. There are something like 195 states in the world, I believe. I believe that's the right number. Every one of them has some kind of leader, but not every leader is a statesman. Statesman is our kind of ideal of what leadership aspires to be. It goes back, the concept of the statesman, since we started with Odysseus, it goes back to ancient Greece. Most famously, it's associated with Plato. Plato writes a dialogue called the Statesman, politikos in Greek. Probably his most famous account of the statesman is the idea of the philosopher king and the republic. So statesman is a leader, but it is a kind of ideal of what leadership is.
It's interesting you bring up Plato and his ideal of the leader in the republic. How rooted in politics is the idea, or should the idea of statesmanship be? Because, of course, Plato's definition of the leader in the republic was almost anti-political.
In some ways, I mean, Plato, of course, in many ways gets the conversation about this started. And he had this idea that the statesman must not just be a leader, but must be a philosopher as well. And of course, trying to find someone who can combine the qualities of leading a state, leading a people, and having the qualities of a philosopher. That's very, very, very rare, very rarefied, if not to say impossible to achieve. But one of the points, just to kind of fast forward to my book, one of the points I want to make, I make about the statesman is, while statesmen are certainly leaders and they must have the qualities of leadership, foresight, determination, courage, a kind of strength of will, a willingness to go it alone, a willingness to say unpopular things when necessary, to speak
to lie,
in that
Stephen,
way.
Coming back to Machiavelli.
We'll get to that in a moment. But I mean, one of the points, or if not the central point I want to make in the book about the statesman, is that the statesman the statesman is an educator of people, not necessarily a philosopher in the strictest sense of the term, but an educator who leads through language, who leads through giving a people the language they need to think about themselves. If you want a couple of examples of this, my favorite example is, of course, Abraham Lincoln, whose, among other things, whose Gettysburg Address shaped the way in which Americans think about democracy.
Right, and you
provided the language.
Yeah, you edited a book on the writings of Abraham Lincoln, so you're all too familiar with his work.
Thank you for that shout out. It's true. In Britain, of course, the great statesmen of Churchill and Disraeli and others also provided the language in which the Britons think about it. When de Gaulle said famously in his memoirs, "I have a certain idea of France," de Gaulle led with a kind of conception of what it was to be French and what the role of France was in the world. That was created through a kind of civic learning and a civic knowledge that made him able to communicate his philosophy, as it were. We can use that in the broader sense of the term, communicate it to people and allowed them to believe that about themselves. That's what I think is central to the statesman, is that statesmen in a way shape the language and develop the language and self-understanding that people have of themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Lincoln. We'll come back to him. You also talk about de Gaulle and Churchill. Mm-hmm. I wonder what the relationship, Stephen, I'm sure you deal with this in the book, is between statesmanship and timing. Mm-hmm. After all, Churchill was an outsider for much of his political life. He never changed his opinions, but the times changed, and his view of the world was unpopular. He was the anti-statesman in many ways. He had serious political disasters, including the catastrophe at Gallipoli. And then, of course, European politics changed, and he became a statesman. So and in some ways, I guess the same is true of de Gaulle. And even Lincoln, of course, was in his own way a prisoner of history. So what's the relationship between statesmanship and history? I know you've also written extensively on Hegel. What did Hegel say about statesmanship and, shall we say, timing, or the chance
Right.
of history?
Well, you've either read my book or you've anticipated it beautifully, because I have a important discussion of the role of time, timing, contingency in statesmanship, because it is very much a matter of timing. Let's use Churchill, who was in many ways had great success, but also, as you mentioned, Gallipoli, tremendous failure. He was out of power for a long time. Particularly in 1930s, he
Changed
supported
political
himself.
party. I mean,
He
he
was
changed
writing,
political
changed parties,
parties.
and yet, when the moment came, he was there. He was prepared for it, and fortunately, his colleagues understood this. So it's an ability to sort of seize the moment, seize the time. One kind of metaphor we often use about this, and is often used, is when the time is ripe. And of course, it's always very difficult to know when exactly is the time ripe. To just give an example, in the pre-World War I period, there was a lot of discussion, particularly among Marxist theoreticians, about when was the time ripe for a revolution in Russia. Were the theory was that the productive forces of society needed to be developed to such a degree that the time made it ripe for a revolution. And there's a great discussion among Marxist theoreticians. Had capitalist forces developed to make the time ripe? And of course, Lenin helped to decide that for them. Lenin just believed the time was ripe whenever there was a party with sufficient willpower and sufficient strength of purpose to seize the moment. That went that way. But timing is essential, and in many ways, look at Churchill. His time in June 1940 was central, and what happened as soon as the peace was established? He was voted out of office. So many of the qualities that make people fit for leadership and make people fit for guidance at a particular moment in time are not the same qualities they want in people at a different time. It seems very ungrateful. But as you go back to Hegel, Hegel says, Hegel has a very interesting discussion of statesmanship. He speaks of what he calls world historical individuals. And his examples are people like Caesar and Napoleon and Alexander the Great, and these kind of great kind of world shapers in some ways. And he says that history has a way of using them. Hegel had this idea of history as a process with its own purpose, and it uses these people, and it uses it to achieve certain historical ends. And when those ends are achieved, history just discards. They're discarded. And even if you don't accept, as I don't, the sort of grand historical narrative that Hegel gives, it is true that statesmen are often cruelly discarded by their own people after they have achieved their ending. And there's kind of a tragedy to that. And I think that is a point I try to illustrate in the book.
Well, it gives a tragic quality to history. I'm intrigued, Stephen, that you bring up Lenin. Of course, as you note, he seized the opportunity, although many Marxists would argue that the tragedy or the catastrophe of the Russian Revolution was that Russia, at least in a Marxist or a historiographical sense, wasn't ready for a Marxist communist revolution. So in your argument on statesmanship, is Lenin a statesman, a failed statesman, a wannabe statesman?
My answer to that is no. I mean, I do talk about people like Lenin, Hitler, even Napoleon, who were certainly, without doubt, founders of states, to be sure. But they were founders, in the case of Lenin or Hitler, of vast tyrannies. In the case of Napoleon, of a kind of, military dictator, military emperor. These are not strictly statesmen, although they've certainly changed the course of history decisively and dramatically. But a statesman is somebody who establishes or maintains. I do have different categories of different statesmen. Stable systems of government, which use rule of law, and is central to a statesman is the importance of a certain kind of rule of law, of constitutionalism in the broadest sense of that term, and also a willingness to, once again, not only help to shape people through language, but to also to listen, to have the capacity to hear and to accept often less than the whole loaf.
So going back to the Russia of 1917, were there statesmen around? Were they the architects of perhaps the first Russian Revolution, Prince Kerensky? Other constitutionalists? Is your definition of statesmanship rooted in a kind of respect for the law, constitutionality?
It is my view of the statesman, at least in the modern world, is rooted in, and I have a discussion of this, the emergence of constitutionalism in Western societies, constitutionalism, as it emerged largely, I'm going to say, in the post-Renaissance period, the consolidation of modern states as we understand them today, states that are bounded by constitutions, by rule of law. Eventually, this became identified with, the separation or balance of powers, political parties. These are the conditions in which statesmen, as we understand the term today, operate. It's quite different from the ancient world. I do talk about certain ancient statesmen like Pericles, but in the modern world, I want to say, statesmanship is largely, for me, identified with the emergence of the great constitutional democracies, first in England and America, and then throughout Europe and throughout various other parts of the world as well. But it cannot be simply, it's not simply, as I say, a term that can be associated or appropriated by any leader or founder who acts through violence, through, again, the systematic use of terror and political ideology.
As I said, you're a professor of political science and of philosophy at Yale, so you're a very distinguished man. You're also an expert on Leo Strauss. You wrote a book, Reading Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss, a very influential German-American political philosopher, often accused of being a conservative, one of the founders, perhaps in some ways, of 20th century conservative thought. Some people might be listening to this, Stephen, and thinking, well, here's a white professor at Yale, well-versed in Leo Strauss and the other theorists of Western philosophy from Plato and Socrates onwards. He rejects any alternative to the Western tradition when it comes to a notion like statesmanship. Are there non-Western examples? What about somebody like Nelson Mandela?
Oh, listen, absolutely. I have discussion of Mandela and Nkrumah, Ben Gurion, several. Lee Kuan Yew. I'm an admirer of Lee Kuan Yew.
But he's hardly a Democrat, Lee Kuan Yew.
He's not a Democrat, and you don't need to be a Democrat to be a constitutionalist. Constitutionalism isn't simply synonymous with democracy. It is synonymous with a kind of, I would say, rule of law regime. And I think Lee Kuan Yew admirably fills that role. I think, there were certain authoritarian, again, much of going back to issues of context and circumstance. Democracy isn't, as we understand it, isn't necessarily the rule for every place in the world. I'm not a monoculturalist in that way. I don't believe that every place must be democratic. But one can, if one thinks a little more capaciously about the term constitutionalism. I think you can see someone like Lee Kuan Yew fitting that discussion. Nelson Mandela is a wonderful example. I have a discussion of statesmen without states. Martin Luther King would have been an example of this. Nelson Mandela, before he became head of state, these were people who very much moved their countries in a certain direction, even though they didn't occupy formal office, although Mandela later did. And another example I use of someone like that is Václav Havel in the former Czechoslovakia, who was spent several years in a communist prison, later became head of state, but whose actions even prior to that really did help to form a resistance movement in Czechoslovakia in the same way that Mandela did in South Africa. So these were tremendous. Gandhi, and in India too, in the same way. Again, never held office in a strict sense, but did shape the way in which independence was conceived. So these are definitely. It's not just. It's just not a white male Straussian list of the kind you were suggesting. Even though I would always say I've learned a lot from Leo Strauss.
Yeah, the book is called On Statesmanship rather than On Stateswomanship. And so far, Stephen, you know better than I do, you've only mentioned men. You've mentioned Mandela and Havel and Churchill and de Gaulle and Lincoln. You've rejected Lenin and Hitler and Napoleon as statesmen. Is there a masculine quality to your definition of statesmanship? Are there women? I mean, I'm guessing you might include somebody like Margaret Thatcher as an example of a statesman, although, of course, maybe we should redefine, rewrite the word as stateswoman.
Well, I meant in a footnote early in the book, I have to say, right, the term I realize is gendered today, which is one reason why it's out of fashion, the kind of gendered character of it. But I mean, in a way, let's be honest, for most of history, women have been excluded from offices of state. Couldn't even vote until the 20th century. So by definition, most of the people we call statesmen will be men. Although that is by no means to exclude women. And to answer your question, yes, I do regard Margaret Thatcher, who I discuss in the book, as an example of a statesman. I don't want to use statesperson, stateswoman. It's a ugly. Let's just use the traditional term, and I think I hope nobody's going to misunderstand or object to that. But I think Indira Gandhi, I think Margaret Thatcher, I think are certainly high examples of statecraft. Could call it statecraft.
Yeah, going back to the Odyssey, again, I know you haven't seen it, but you know the story. In the movie, of course, Odysseus is presented as this slightly ambivalent leader or wannabe leader, and whereas his wife Penelope is viewed in a much more sympathetic way, much more skilled, perhaps in pushing off literally and metaphorically the suitors and inventing stories to make sure that she can wait for her husband. I wonder, again, going back to Homer and the way in which it presents maybe Odysseus as the male and Penelope as the female, are there different qualities that perhaps Penelope manifests in the Odyssey of a cleverness, which perhaps certainly Odysseus doesn't quite have, an ability to spin tales, which maybe women are better at in some ways than men, or maybe we should be careful about making any gendered generalizations.
I mean, I think that's a good point about the Odyssey and about the role of Penelope in it. She is a spinner, a weaver, and that obviously connects to ideas of being able to, kind of deceive and so on. She has this capacity too, very much. Although I'm not sure that in the modern world, women who ascend to the ultimate positions of political power and influence, and who really are statesmen, are necessarily, I would be reticent to say that there's some gendered skill that they bring to their craft. I mean, I think Mrs. Thatcher was tough-minded, and she certainly had she famously had to, didn't she had to buck up George Bush, I think she told him at one point.
And
So
Ronald Reagan.
yeah,
Reagan famously, when he said develop
yeah.
a spine or a backbone, I think
Right.
it was.
I mean, I think they were skeptical or ambivalent about the Falkland War, and she really had to show them that she was tough and meant business. And I think that was true of most female leaders today, which a quality that I very much admire in them.
You're also the author of Modernity and Its Discontents. The gorilla in the room here, Stephen, that we haven't mentioned, of course, is the crisis of leadership in the West today.
Right.
I don't want to turn this into another conversation about the American president.
Right.
But I'm guessing you wrote this book in part as a reaction against either the increasingly dictatorial nature of political leadership in democracies, or its technocratic leader.
Yes.
I mean, statesmen have always been in short supply. There's always been a scarcity of statesmen throughout history. But are we living in the 2020s at a time where we're particularly lacking statesmanship, or is it just a feature perhaps of the Anglo-American political landscape?
Well, I think a little of both. I mean, and when I watch what happened in Britain recently, and the turnover of political power there, seven prime ministers in the last decade, that is really a kind of a sorry observation about the quality of leadership and also people's willingness to go along. Yes, but we are experiencing a paucity of significant leaders, and in my book, the only one I can point to in our current moment, and I say God bless him, is Volodymyr Zelensky, who I say is doing a stirring imitation of Winston Churchill. He really shows the qualities to me, he has shown the qualities of leadership and guts and magnanimity in this horrible moment for him and his people, and has showed a real ability and skill. I admire him immensely. But you really have to look far and wide to find anybody else who I think defines that. Now, that's not that unusual. As I say in the book, statesmen, you can't just will them into existence. And this is in many ways a relatively rare political phenomenon. When you look at the 20th century, we're kind of, in many ways, kind of blessed with people who rose to the occasion, the de Gaulles, the FDRs, who figures, in an important way in my book as well. FDR was a wonderful example. And in more recent, relatively recent times, I would put Reagan in that category as well. Somebody who really, again, in many ways, helped to redefine how Americans think about themselves, providing us with language and a kind of, he brought to his office, he was not a learned man necessarily, but he brought a kind of substance of character with him that I think is something we haven't really spoken about. But one of the certainly the qualities of the statesman that distinguishes them from other kinds of political leaders, certain kind of character that they bring, certain kind of moral qualities, moral virtues that instill trust with people, that inspire a willingness to listen, and those are qualities that can't, again, simply be wished into existence. It requires a certain kind of person to achieve that.
Yeah, I'm curious, Stephen, as to your take on Barack Obama. The book is out now, but in a way, some of the arguments I know you make on statesmanship, Obama knew before he became president. Was he? It's almost as if he could have written this book himself and was trying to become a statesman. Some people would argue that he failed. Again, it comes back to timing, doesn't it? What do you make of somebody like Obama, who knew all the arguments, all the intricacies, and all the contradictions of what it requires to be a statesman, and yet probably failed ultimately?
Right. Yeah, I mean, Obama's a bit of an enigma to me, and I wish he would read the book. I mean, I would love to hear what his thoughts are. He's not. I wouldn't call him a failed statesman, but I mean, I'm not sure I would think that he rises to the top of the heap. When I think he had many admirable qualities. He certainly had the quality of kind of civic seriousness that I think is necessary for a statesman.
And a love of language and an ability to speak brilliantly.
Absolutely. He had the rhetorical, and in many ways the rhetorical gifts. He didn't have, in a final analysis, he lacked something. He lacked a kind of a term I use in the book, and I hesitate to use this term because here he was, a black man, and our first African American president. I mean, to achieve what he did, just that alone is an extraordinary feat. So I'm a little hesitant to say what I'm about to say in a minute. He lacked the quality of what Bismarck called civil courage. He didn't seem when he didn't seem willing to get into the fight in a way that I think probably he needed to. He was often, and I think one of the takes on him, which I would agree, is a bit aloof in some ways, kind of aloof from the game. And he didn't really seem to enjoy in the same way the kind of hard knocks, which is interesting because he's a guy from, he's not originally from, but he came to the south side of Chicago, which is a tough place. I actually grew up on the south side of Chicago. So we were, you might say, neighbors in a way, although I wasn't living there at that time. But he needed, I think he needed a little more toughness to achieve.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had Sally Quinn on the show recently, the wife of Ben Bradley, one of DC's most acute observers. Her critique of Obama was he didn't get out enough, but then, of course, he was a victim of the history of race, and I know his defenders would argue that he was very much limited by what he thought white America in particular expected of a black president.
Right.
So he wasn't able to perhaps rise up to the statesmanship that you're calling for. So, Stephen, as we imagine, hopefully, a post-Trump America, clearly Trump is the antithesis of the statesman. I'm guessing you would argue that too. Is that fair?
Let me just say, I don't think he's the antithesis exactly, but he certainly does not qualify as a statesman.
How would he fit into your argument about statesmanship?
Any of the qualities. Let me just say first, I specifically did not want the book to be a book about Donald Trump, and it isn't.
Right, and I don't want to pull you into that swamp because it gets very boring.
He's mentioned one or two times in the book. He's not a statesman. I don't think that's necessarily a particularly controversial statement, except among his, most ardent supporters. Even if you voted for him, you don't necessarily have to think of him as, a great statesman. But he is often the example. I have a chapter devoted to anti-statesmen. Technocrats, that was a word you used earlier. The kind of certain models of leadership which are not statesmanly in my view. The technocrat is one. The demagogue is another. It's an ancient, again, the demagogue is a Greek term. Demagoge, it means a leader of the people, literally. And demagoguery is in many ways implicated in democracy. Democracies often are breeding grounds for demagogues, and I think Trump, in many ways, is in many ways a kind of classic demagogue. He he wants to lead through fear, through intimidation, through humiliation. He's an effective rouser of the passions, of people's passions of anger and resentment. But that's not what a statesman does.
So again, I dragged you into the Trumpian swamp. My apologies for that. It's the last we'll talk about him. As America, though, begins to think about a post-Trump America to 2028, and the Democrats in particular trying to figure out how to reinvent or restart the conversation with America. What advice does your book on statesmanship, what advice would it give to aspiring statesmen in the America of the late 20s and indeed the 2030s? Clearly, America is in need of a statesman. I think that's fairly self-evident.
I think an important thing, if I could give advice to the Democratic Party, and I don't think anybody's listening to me in particular in this, but if they were, I would do everything you can. And actually, Andrew, this goes back, what I'm going to say goes back a little bit to a previous book that I wrote called Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. I think the Democrats need to find a way to be far more affirmative than they are as a party about America and what it stands for. There needs to be a more positive vision of America and its history. The Democrats have embraced two models of politics, both of which I think are problematic for statesmanship. One of which is kind of a technocratic liberal model that the president should be a problem solver and have new policies for every issue. You just be kind of a technocrat in chief. And the other is a kind of, which is not unrelated to that, is this kind of progressive model of statesmanship, which also has a way of diminishing the past. The progressive looks at the past as a kind of benighted world of ignorance and failure, in many ways stained by slavery and racism and all kinds of problems, and that we're constantly having to escape from our benighted past. The Democrats have to find a way both to speak to provide a broader narrative about where they stand in the scope of American history, to provide a narrative of that, and do more to connect with people's sense of what it is to be an American and what it is. And this is something the Democrats have failed to do. Trump has done that in a kind of crude way, make America great again. It is connected with, it tries to connect itself, and for many people does connect to a certain kind of vision of what America used to be, but isn't anymore. The Democrats need an affirmative view of American history and American society, and to embed themselves in that narrative. That's what JFK did. That's what FDR did, although he wasn't a Democrat. That's what Lincoln did. That's what Reagan did. These are what all the great American leaders have done, and what the Democrats and Republicans, for that matter, need to think about, in my opinion.
So in the way you're presenting it, it sounds to me as if a J.D. Vance or a Marco Rubio are more suited, perhaps, to acquiring the mantle or using the language that you introduce in On Statesmanship to American politics than the Democrat.
Well, Vance seems to have doubled down on a kind of nativism, which he's given voice to nativism with a kind of recent religious tinge to it as he's converted to Catholicism, which I think has been an ongoing trend in American politics going back to the 19th century. It's an ugly movement. It does connect with some people, but it's not what it's not what we need at the moment. And I would very much think of his narrative as a kind of narrative of exclusion. I mean, who counts as an American on his view? He seems to believe unless your family was here at least back until the Civil War in the mid-19th century, you're not somehow an American. You don't really have roots here in the same way. And I find that Lincoln had that problem to deal with in his time. The Know Nothing Party at that time, which was an anti-immigrant party, mainly about anti-Irish immigrants who were coming here in large number at that point. So nativism is an ugly side of American populism, of which Vance, it seems to me, has tapped into, and will continue to ride that into the post-Trumpian age.
Finally, Stephen, your book is on statesmanship. It's a book about how we need and what statesmanship exactly is. What does the world look like without statesmanship? What's the warning in the book? If we don't get on statesmanship, what does the world look like? Is it a technocratic world or a demagogic one, or a mix of the two?
It's if you want to see what the world is like without statesmen, look at the world we seem to be heading into at the moment. It's going to be a world of sheer power politics, where the strong, a line from Thucydides, which several members of the recent administration have repurposed for their own ends. In politics, the strong do what they like, the weak suffer what they must. That's going to be the world without statesmen, because that's an ugly world, and it will be increasingly, I think, dominated by spheres of influence, whether it's Iran, Russia, China, carving up the world according to their own power, where their power leads them, and with very little sense of the virtues of, as I was saying, constitutional statecraft and a free society that we spoke about earlier.
Well, there you have it. The stakes are indeed high. I don't think that's news for anyone. An important new book on statesmanship, more of a manual in many ways, a very short book by Stephen B. Smith, a very distinguished professor of philosophy and political science at Yale University. Stephen, congratulations on the book. Wonderful conversation. You've certainly convinced me of the importance of statesmanship. Thank you so much.
Andrew, it's my pleasure. Lovely to be with you.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again. Thank you.